Happy International Workers' Day, everyone. As I mentioned, my name is Rachel Herzig. I am from the Center for Political Education, and I want to thank you for joining us for another Friday night forum. For those of you who are new, thank you for joining us. For those of you who are returning, we're grateful to have you back. Friday night forums are a collaboration between the Red Nation, Center for Political Education, and Arab Organizing and Resource Center. They're critical conversations on settler colonialism, US imperialism, decolonization, and internationalism. And because the COVID-19 pandemic is global, our responses to it must also be global. And Friday night forums give us an opportunity to be exposed to new perspectives and to learn lessons about organizing from around the world with attention to decolonizing Turtle Island. We are currently live streaming on the Facebook pages for all of the sponsoring organizations. So tell a friend to check us out on CPE's Facebook page or the Red Nation's Facebook page or AROC's Facebook page. We're also recording tonight's webinar. So if you want to watch it again or you want to share it with somebody, you'll be able to find it on the Red Nation's YouTube channel. And please do plan to join us next week when we'll be discussing sanctions against Iran. It'll be the same time, same place as the past few weeks. Tonight, in celebration of May Day, we'll be talking about organizing workers during the pandemic. Many of us have encountered information about essential workers and the risks that they're being asked or required to take to keep life moving along for the rest of us. Healthcare workers, food chain workers, sanitation and transit workers, warehouse workers, people working for delivery services, and many, many others are on our minds right now as their labor makes it possible for us to do things like follow stay-at-home orders, for instance. There are also lots of stories about all of the people who are out of work right now, those seeking unemployment benefits and other sources of relief, those who may not have work to return to, and those who have become too sick to work. The crisis is, of course, most deeply affecting the most vulnerable workers among us, those who are precariously employed, gig workers, those providing direct services and care, all of those without guaranteed work or employee benefits. And as we know, women of color are bearing the heaviest burdens of all. At the same time, there's lots of organizing happening among workers. Unionized workers continue their fights for safe, sustainable workplaces, to be compensated adequately, to be treated with dignity. These unionized workers are increasingly being joined by during the COVID-19 crisis by organized groups of non-unionized workers who have been banding together across work sites and across employers to demand that they be protected at work, that they be fairly compensated for working under hazardous conditions, that they have access to sick days and paid time off, and that they not face retaliation for organizing. Workers' struggles are also being tied to related social issues, such as eviction defense and rent strikes, to opposition to defense spending, and to international efforts, such as the Week of 2020 Anti-Imperialist Struggle that I'm hoping we'll hear more about later from Vijay. We know that the ravages of capitalist exploitation are not new nor unique to this pandemic. They may be in sharper relief for some during this time, and the stakes may be higher. The current crisis also creates potential openings to make demands and push further toward the futures we need, and people around the world are taking up that challenge. That's why I'm so excited that tonight we're being joined by such inspiring thinkers and doers to help us learn more about what's at stake and what our fights must be now. So without further ado, I would like to introduce this evening's speakers: Vinny Cortez, the co-president of National Nurses United; Kali Akuno, co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson; and Vijay Prashad, director of Continental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of the New Delhi-based Leftward Books. I'm gonna turn things over to Zenei right now. If you would please use the chat function and the Q&A function to share any questions that you have for the speakers. We'll make sure that those get to them and we can engage with those after everybody's spoken. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Zenei.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Vinny Cortez. I'm a frontline bedside nurse and co-president of the California Nurses Association, National Nurses United. I have been a registered nurse for 40 years, and over that time, I've treated patients with AIDS, SARS, and other contagious diseases. Until now, every time I have cared for infectious patients, I have received proper personal protective equipment because we all know that keeping nurses safe is crucial for keeping patients safe. With COVID-19, many employers, not just here in the United States, but also around the world, are failing to provide nurses with the N95 respirators and other protective equipment that we need to keep ourselves safe and prevent our patients from being infected. The United States is now the global epicenter of this disease. Earlier this week, we exceeded 1 million confirmed cases of COVID-19. This is almost 1/3 of all cases globally. More than a quarter of all COVID-19 related deaths have occurred in the United States. The US, along with Britain, has also had the most known deaths of nurses and healthcare providers. This is largely due to the failure by our government and by our employers to provide us with the optimal protective personal equipment, also known as PPE, those that we need to stay safe. The crisis has exposed more than ever the protection of workers is both local and a global issue. To get the equipment, safe staffing, and scientifically grounded safety standards that we need, nurses are organizing on all fronts in our hospitals, in our states, nationally, and globally. If there is one thing this horrifying global pandemic has accomplished, it is the reminder that we are one people no matter where we live. The virus has no borders. It recognizes no nationality, no race, no ethnicity, and certainly no immigration status. But the failings in our systems and response are intensifying inequalities and injustices in our societies. Nurses are uniting in solidarity across borders to protect ourselves, our patients, and the planet, and in the process, we continue to build worker power globally. I've been asked to speak about our union's work with Global Nurses United Network and how the network is acting globally to improve working conditions for nurses around the world. Global Nurses United is a federation of premier nurses and healthcare workers unions in 29 nations. It is a network of workers whose industrial power comes from providing essential care to patients around the world. GNU was formed in the spirit of solidarity around the principle that all people deserve access to healthcare as a human right. The Federation was created 7 years ago in 2013 to address the issues that nurses dedicated to social justice everywhere in the world have in common. It was born from the idea that we are one planet, one people, dedicated to caring for each other. Nurses everywhere face common threats. These includes attacks on public health and on healthcare workers, austerity, privatization policies, climate crises, and global pandemics. As a network of trade unions, affiliates of GNU are committed to working for safe nurse-to-patient staffing ratios and improved patient care for all. And we fight to protect patients on many forms. This means we advocate for patients at the bedside, and we also engage in social justice advocacy in our fights for equitable healthcare systems and environmental justice, because nobody is healthy on a dying planet. And GNU was formed with the idea that by working together across national borders, we are all stronger when we stand united rather than when we act separately. COVID-19 has united us more than ever before. Early in the crisis, it was clear that hospitals around the world were not prepared to provide nurses and other healthcare workers with the equipment we need to deliver safe, efficient care. In the face of unknown threats, nurses advocate for practicing the precautionary principle, which simply means that until we have the scientific research that proves we are safe, we must take all necessary safety precautions. In contrast to this, during the pandemic, early in the pandemic, the CDC and the World Health Organization pushed to relax and weaken guidelines for worker protections, even though the scientific community was still scrambling to discover exactly how this novel coronavirus spreads. At the same time, many employers, were hiding information from employees about their possible or unknown exposure for COVID-19. While global health organizations and corporations were ready to abandon science, nurses' trade unions, with the GNU in the lead, have been a vital collective voice calling for precaution and protection of nurses and other healthcare workers, as well as other essential workers who are still on the job during this pandemic. From the beginning of this pandemic, it has been really important for us to unite the world's nurses' unions with one voice. We began with education, sharing the most up-to-date research on best practices and new science on the health impacts of the virus. As a global family of unionized nurses, we also banded together to make demands that the World Health Organization strengthen guidelines on prevention and control of the virus causing COVID-19. We were able to make these demands because we know that nurses and other healthcare workers are at the heart of patient care and essential to the COVID-19 response. We wrote a joint letter signed by leaders of nurses' unions from Australia, Brazil, Canada, Costa Rica, Curacao, Dominican Republic, Greece, Guatemala, Honduras, India, Ireland, Kenya, Paraguay, the Philippines, Portugal, Rwanda, South Korea, Spain, Taiwan, Uganda, the United States, and Uruguay. In the letter, we asserted our fundamental rights as workers to a safe and healthy workplace, and we called attention to how endangering healthcare workers puts the hospitals and entire regions at risk if a surge, like those we have seen in many cities, were to occur. In late March, we held webinar conferences with GNU leaders from 27 countries from North America, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. These meetings took place at a time when some countries were at a peak in the crisis, while others, like the United States, were just beginning to shelter in place. For many of us, it was the first time we'd seen one another since we convened for the historic Global Nurses Solidarity Assembly here in San Francisco in September of 2019. The online meetings were an opportunity for us to inform and to provide comfort and share our stories and our struggles. And it also gave us a chance to support fellow nurses in locations hardest hit or in countries with low union capacity. Some of our unions have long histories of militant organizing, while others are new formations that are only beginning to develop. So it was important for us to pool our knowledge and learn from other countries about what has worked and what has not in the face of the virus. We shared our common experiences and built unity around our understanding of the science and necessary protective equipment that nurses and other healthcare workers need to stay safe. We also learned firsthand from countries like Italy how hospitals were attempting to skirt obligations to provide PPE with scientifically unsound antibody testing. This prepared us to fight back when hospitals in the United States started to suggest that nurses tested for antibodies should go back to work without protective equipment. We discussed why the lack of PPE made hospitals a leading source for the spread of COVID-19, and we continue to help each other out by identifying where PPE is available and how to pressure hospitals to provide it to its workers. We heard of the tragic plight of nurses in embattled Italy and Spain, as well as the United States, contrasted with the more effective national responses in South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Cuba, where public officials, led by frontline healthcare workers, responded more quickly with safety precautions, from rapid testing to physical distancing to treatment. We were reminded once again that nursing is a global profession and that we are truly all in this together, fighting for our lives, our patients' lives, our community lives, and the lives of workers around the world. One happy result came out of this important networking. It was the affiliation to GNU of the largest union of registered nurses in Italy, Nursint. The Italian nurses expressed their appreciation to GNU for bringing them together with nurses from around the world, especially when they were faced with the worst of the pandemic. One GNU web of global solidarity continues to inspire nurses to speak up, organize, and fight for justice. In the US, this is especially important for nurses who have immigrated to the United States. In California, where I work, nearly 20% of registered nurses are Filipino. We are most likely to work in acute care, in medical surgical units, and in the ICU, which puts us in the front lines of care for COVID-19 patients. The complicated global history of Filipino nurses in the United States and the experience of racism and exploitation in here has often inhibited Filipino nurses from speaking out against horrible practices of our corporate employers. But now, Filipino American nurses are becoming one of the key forces in fighting back against this pandemic. The Tagalog word pakikisama describes how many Filipinos feel a strong sense of loyalty or the importance of putting the welfare of the group over that of the individual. As nurses, we are so passionate about our profession and what we do, and we sometimes forget about our own welfare, and we treat our patients like our own family. With Global Nurses United, we reaffirm that our fellow nurses are also our family, and that when we stand up for our safety and protection, we are also standing up for nurses around the world. Even at the most local level, nursing is a global profession. When this crisis has passed, GNU will continue our unified fight to keep the profit motives that has plagued the US healthcare from infecting the universal healthcare systems and workers in other countries. In the 7 years that GNU Network has existed, we have watched the rise of right-wing populism and austerity, incrementally weakening the health system of other countries. Our fight to put patients over profits here matters for nurses and patients everywhere. The pandemic has clearly exposed how much our country needs an effective single-payer healthcare system. We will continue to wage this fight here in the United States, nationally, with the full support of global solidarity. We know that the corporate healthcare lobby in this country is fighting hard to make the regulatory rules everywhere else the same as in the United States. Kicking corporate greed out of our system is also important for keeping it out of other systems. Our struggles are global. We are united as workers of the world. So in closing, I would like to invite you to support our fight. We have an online petition you can sign at protectnurses.org, and currently it has about 250,000 signatures. To learn more about the unions in the 28 GNU member countries, please visit our website, nationalnurses.org/global-nurses-united. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Zenei, so much for sharing information about Global Nurses United with us. I'm going to turn things over now to Kali.
All right. Can folks hear me? I had myself on mute. Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. Hope you've had a festive May Day. We've had a pleasurable one here that we think will be a launching pad for a long, protracted struggle in the many months and years to come, because we think that's what it's going to take to overcome the disaster capitalism being unleashed upon us in the face of COVID-19 by the forces of the right and by capital, which is underpinning the forces of the right. So just to jump in a little bit to chronicle some of our experience. Many of you don't know, we are I'm a part of a small little project in Jackson, Mississippi, called Cooperation Jackson. And we are a network, a growing network of worker-owned cooperative businesses and a community land trust, which work in equal relationship with each other as part of a strategy of decommodifying land first and foremost, as part of a program which will require a larger, longer term political struggle of decolonizing the land itself. And with that, really challenging the settler state of Mississippi as it presently exists, and building a stronger movement throughout the South and the country to challenge the very nature of this society. It's long-term objectives that we're pursuing. Easier said than done, but trying to pick up that baton and torch and carry it on. Just a little bit about the work and what it looked like before the pandemic really took effect. And I'm stressing before because we are doing some serious reorganizing now, and what may come out of this may look profoundly different than what we started with. But we had 3 fully operational co-ops. That was Freedom Farms, which is an urban farming cooperative, the Green Team, which was a lawn care and other kind of agricultural services that they were, really kicking up. And then we had the Community Production Cooperative, which is a small, lightweight manufacturing cooperative, which specializes in digital fabrication. And for those of you who don't know what that means, probably the most famous end of that is 3D printing, but it's actually much more than that in terms of digitizing various forms of production and then reproducing that with a number of different tools to do precision molding, cutting, welding, etc. And what we had in mind to do with it was everything from producing water purifiers, which are very much needed in our community, to furniture, to actually building homes, utilizing sustainable materials that we could grow here in Mississippi, including hemp and some other products, bamboo and hemp in particular. And then we had the Community Land Trust, the Fannie Hammer Community Land Trust, which as of February, was able to put together over 5 acres of urban land, the largest piece being a block that we basically owned. It had a shopping center on it that used to house a grocery store that we're working on bringing back very diligently. a black-owned grocery store that kind of was chased out through some bad business deals of our neighborhood and left a huge food desert, if you would, a food apartheid in our community. So trying to overcome that were some of the critical things that we were laying out to do as part of our strategic plan. And even before this kicked in, we were in the midst of doing a new 5-year strategic plan to adjust to some of the new conditions that have emerged in Jackson over the past 2 or 3 years, but also try to innovate a number of different things. Like many projects, I think around the world, particularly, very localized, autonomous-oriented, grassroots projects, we've been profoundly impacted by COVID-19. Of all of our operations, the one that has remained, fully operational has been the farming operation. And that's because the way in which we've been doing it, there was already a certain level of physical distancing involved because it's a real scattered site. We don't have one large plot of land in the urban area. We have some outside the urban area, but in the urban area, it's like folks are tending to small half-acre or 1 acre, I think is the largest. They were tending to that and largely working in teams of 2 where they could separate already. So that kind of had a built-in dynamic of physical distancing that we could kind of maintain and be healthy. And the second reason was a political reason. And I'm bringing this up in a little time I have now to just really bring home our thinking even before this around how food has been used as a weapon against the Black community here in Jackson, but Black communities all over the empire, not just Black communities, all oppressed and working class communities, particularly in the United States. And we learned some hard lessons here in Mississippi from Hurricane Katrina. And it should be understood that a lot of what you may have been exposed to or heard about the Jackson Cush plan, a pivotal point in the construction of that plan and in a lot of its underpinnings were learning some strategic key lessons from Hurricane Katrina about how the state, particularly the modern U.S. state, is not vested or situated, and this is long before Trump, in actually providing either a public service or trying to take care of the need of those who are in its care, be they citizens or wards or detainees. We learned the hard way that that is not something that they were interested in, and we've been determined since 2015 to try to do a level of autonomous, self-reliant production and to federate with other folks doing similar work to build and aggregate our power in the long term. So we kept the farm open as a political choice to make sure that based on our particular read of the situation, that our community, to the greatest extent possible, wouldn't be facing some major hunger crisis, a month or 2 months down the road. And it was our initial summation that this crisis was going to last about 6 months. People may have seen 2 of the initial statements that we put out that was trying to give some framework to this. And let me just be clear on what some of that was really based in, again, personal experience and how we learned it and reflected upon it. But we lost a dear comrade, myself and many others who work in Cooperation Jackson. We lost a dear comrade to SARS about a decade ago. Many of you in the Bay Area will remember my good brother, Javad Jahi, who we lost to SARS. And I can tell you that left a deep impression and scars upon me. And so I've been paying attention to H1N1 and anything that like it that crops up ever since, and known from that direct experience to take these seriously. So in the early days of some of the calls that we put out, we heard from many other left forces that we were being somewhat alarmist in our regard around trying to draw everybody's attention to how serious COVID-19 was. And we had some good early reads from our international practice and orientation of gathering information from a few forces from the Philippines, from Hong Kong, and then from Iran and in Italy that really weighed on us to take this serious, that it's no joke, it's not just a bad flu, but this was a killer. And that if you didn't have the proper personal protective equipment, to really be mindful of what your practice was. So that was a political choice, and it wound up having an impact on us, shutting everything down fairly immediately outside of that particular work. We then tried to extend the capacity, I should know, by shifting some folks over into the helping with the food production. So that has really grown exponentially in the last couple of weeks, and I think we're seeing yields of that now. In being able to distribute not only some of the things I talked about with the mass challenge that we took on, but being able to start distributing some of the food, for free to the community. As most of the things that we've been able to do has come, people have generously given from all over the world to help us do our production around food, and also the mass work that we've been doing. So we've been giving that all away for free as a point of both a political principle, but also to demonstrate, to our own community, to others, what mutual aid and solidarity and joint sharing can do to provide people what they need immediately without monetary exchange. And this is a core political lesson that we're trying to bring home to other forces in our community, that we do have the capacity and capability to not only, do some innovative, creative things with the little tools that we have, but that we can actually change some of the dimensions of production and exchange on a local level and extend that up nationally. That's part of the political struggle we're trying to wage. I'll say this because it leads to how we kind of arrived at our particular call for mass action leading towards a general strike that we're pushing for. Being veterans of Hurricane Katrina, we immediately kind of kicked in gear in early March to start setting up, mutual aid programs. And we heard from some comrades, in particular from Italy, from both Milan and Naples, who had been at it by that time almost 3 weeks, ahead of us, because the crisis hit them earlier than it really hit here in the United States. And they told us in no uncertain terms, stop, back off of doing that. If you cannot provide, the PPE, the personal protective equipment, to all those who are volunteer with you, just outright stop. And the reason being, every single one of the folks, in their collectives, one was more anarchist orientated, the other one more communist oriented. They said that every one of their comrades who volunteered got sick. Now, fortunately, none of them passed in either Naples or Milan from those who were working, but they all got seriously ill, some of them critically ill, and just barely recovered. And given our situation, with our membership, myself included, a lot of us have pre-existing conditions, right? And our base, our membership really reflects some of the demographics that you see, unfortunately, very common here in Mississippi. So we have a lot of folks who have hypertension, a lot of folks who have chronic heart disease, a lot of folks who are suffering from diabetes. So we took heed to that and then backed up off of that and tried to figure out what we could contribute. And that's what really landed us in first and foremost on producing the mask. And so we got some team together, 2 different teams together. One was just 3D printing masks, which we've been very deliberately and intentionally, since that's a longer, more involved process to make, giving those to folks on the front lines, mainly in our case has been nurses and doctors in our communities that we have some network with, but also, some of the folks who've been working in some of the meat pack processing plants that are in our area. And folks may remember there was a major raid on some of those plants here, past fall, that was very politically orchestrated on a federal level by the Trump administration. And the conditions in them prior to COVID-19 were atrocious. And they've offered them no protective gear, but these are folks who are feeding, millions of people in this country, and should be given every level of protection that can be afforded. So we've kind of reserved those for them, since they offer a greater degree of protection than just a cloth mask. But we also organize a team of now 6 folks who are making, cloth masks, 5 days a week. And they've produced several of hundred of them that we've been able to distribute now over the past 5 weeks. In Mississippi, in the context of doing all this, we were in a state where the governor, Tate Reeves, his first and foremost response to the crisis was taking to lecturing the Mississippi public by going on public airwaves and reading the Bible for 2 or 3 hours a day. I kid you not, that was his response. Other than telling people, stay at home if you like. That was the kind of response. And that was in direct opposition to what our mayor's response was, which was to stay at home, stay your butt at home. This is serious, and we all know Mississippi does not have the capacity on a pre-existing level to deal with how chronic and critical this particular virus could be. And so they've basically been at a little war, and it's without question, people know where we line up in that struggle, and we'll continue to line up. But here in Florida, I would argue, in the early days, in early March, were really being used as experimental grounds for the right for their early initial explorations in, can we bring people back to work? Or to what degree can we sacrifice workers? Particularly as it started to become clear who was dying and who was contracting the disease most critically. And here in Mississippi, folks should know, those who've been most impacted and most exposed have been Black women, like overwhelmingly, from particularly the service-oriented jobs and folks working on these food processing lines in particular. So with that being viewed as an expendable population prior to COVID-19, the political risk is, well, if our folks are not dying, we can open back up, and should those workers die, we can easily replace them with another low-wage worker, either from the Black community or the immigrant community. That is literally the public conversation and logic. We hear a more blunt version of it on right-wing radio here, but we saw the initial talking points being converted into national talking points from politicians, in the Republican Party, who made statements as crazy as, there's things more important than life, or the economy is more important than human life, and we can tolerate losing 2 or 3% of the population. So us hearing that and being very critical in our regular practice of monitoring what the right-wing forces are doing here, we tried to jump out ahead when Trump was saying that we should open the country back in Easter, and just try to give a fair warning. There was no way in hell that any of us should have went back to work, particularly when they weren't providing any personal protective equipment for anybody. We're not using the powers, designed for them to call for Emergency Production Act to put that in work, that it would be basically a suicide mission for us to go back. That was the immediate kind of underplay to our response, looking at how it was devastating our community. The other part was a much more strategic piece, and I know my time is running out, so I'll just open it up. And that was and remains, we know that the right is going to use this as an opportunity to reshape, productive relations and social relations, period. They have a motto, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And so we tried to flip the script on that and go back to a lot of our own historic thinking around how to deal with crisis. And why should we let a good crisis go to waste? Particularly as millions of people were being exposed to just the sheer lack of human regard that the capitalist system has, for all of us. People getting a real-time education, and we know that millions of people are going to face, chronic unemployment. This would be a perfect time to start calling for mass action to raise some more transformative demands. So we stepped out there, and took that risk. Many people call us adventurous and insurrectionists for issuing what we stated, but we tried to stand firm and say, we know a general strike will not happen on May Day. We never had that kind of illusion, knowing how many millions of people we would need to organize in the United States, and we're just not there. But we had to put out a call to try to stimulate that type of motion and that type of energy. I hope and think that we did our job well. Time will tell. But that's what led us, based on our own conditions, our own local experiences, and our own understanding of both, the national and international dynamic of where we're at, that led us to make this particular call.
Thank you, Kali. For those of you who joined us a little late, I just want to remind you that was Kali Akuno of Cooperation Jackson. If you're looking for the speaker's affiliations, you can look in the bottom left of your screen there if you're using video. Also, I want to remind you, if you have questions for any of these speakers, please use either the question and answer function or just go ahead and put stuff in the chat. Don't bother raising your hand. We won't be calling on people in that way. So if you want your question heard, please do stick it in one of those things. So I want to turn things over now to Vijay Prashad of Continental Institute for Social Research.
Hello, it's great to be with you. May Day greetings to you. It's a very important day. This is a day that, of course, was born in a struggle in the United States for the 8-hour day, but as is typical with most things, is taken up by the world socialist movement and became a part of my childhood in West Bengal, India. I want to begin with a category that we at Tricontinental are working through, and this is the category of Corona shock. And what this category is helping us understand is to distill the very sharp line that has developed around the world between two kinds of reaction to this global pandemic. On the one side, we have the socialistic countries or regions of the world which have taken a certain kind of approach to this global pandemic. On the other side, we have the bourgeois order, the capitalist bloc, demonstrating quite different attitude. And I'm just going to quickly run through 4 ways to categorize the difference. Then I'm going to suggest some things of the bourgeois order. And then I want to introduce you to some of the work that we are discussing, for instance, in the International Assembly of the Peoples, in the Anti-Imperialist Week Project, and in Tricontinental itself. So first, the 4 different dividing lines. I'd like to compare Vietnam actually with the United States, because Vietnam, right next to bordering China, within a 10-hour bus ride from Wuhan, has seen COVID-19 cases certainly, but no deaths as of now. And the reason for this isn't because it's fortuitous or anything. It's, I think, a great deal to do with the approach taken by Prime Minister Nguyen and the Vietnamese people. On the one side, the government of Vietnam, like the government in Kerala, like the government in Cuba and in other places that we could list, took a science approach to the emergence of the virus first and then the disease as it began to spread. They didn't take a hallucination approach, as Kali talked about, reading the Bible on television, or in India, the government of India saying, go outside and make noise. We know that this is not a science approach to something as devastating as a global pandemic. But in Vietnam, they took a very much scientific approach. The second thing is they had a public sector to turn to immediately, and I'm talking about January of 2020, when just about when the first death was reported from COVID-19 on January 11th, the government of Vietnam directed the public sector to start producing protective equipment, to start producing masks, to start producing hand sanitizer, and so on. At the same time, the health ministry in the United States, Alex Azar, was informed of COVID-19's gravity on the 3rd of January. As the Wall Street Journal noted, for 2 weeks, the Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar was too scared to tell Trump. The American government is blaming China, talking about suppression. You should look into how Alex Azar suppressed the news of COVID-19's lethality and didn't tell Trump, didn't do anything for the entire month of January. On the other side, government of Vietnam, its health ministry pushed very hard to create policies to inform the people, including creating a very clever video about washing hands, which went viral on TikTok and so on. The third aspect, by the way, this public sector production is key. Just about 10 days ago, the government of Vietnam, a country that was ruthlessly bombed by the United States in the 1960s and 70s, ruthlessly, the United States dropped more ordnance on Vietnam than was dropped across World War II. And yet 10 days ago, the people of Vietnam sent 440,000 units of protective clothing to the United States. They sent it out of solidarity, and I'm going to come back to that. That's the fourth point. First point was science-based approach, not a hallucination-based approach. The second one was these countries had a public sector they could turn to, not simply a profit sector which wanted to make money off this pandemic, a great tragedy, you know, where Trump and his cronies were looking to give contracts to their friends and so on. I don't even think of it as a private sector, it's a profit sector. The third distinguishing feature, which I think is very important, is in these places, like in Kerala, there is public action. What Kali is talking about is public action. In Kerala, population of 35 million people, there are about 17 million women. 4.5 million of those women belong to a cooperative movement called Kudumbushri. The moment the health minister, K.K. Shailaja, very formidable person, she began to hold daily press conferences with a health, with a science-based health analysis every day, highly respected person. The moment she started to say that there's a problem, we have students from Kerala in Wuhan, they have an outbreak, we need to move. Kudumbushri immediately shifted their own lines of production and started making masks, hand sanitizers and so on at scale, because they have 4.5 million women as members of this cooperative. In these socialistic parts of the world, public action is something that is very much part of the society. You know, in China, for instance, in one province, 440,000 people volunteered. Neighborhood committees across the country went into action. You know, one of the ways in which anti-communism works is you're told that China is basically a socialistic state that imposes itself on society. People who don't know anything about China don't understand that public action is an enormous part of social existence, about the making of society. Neighborhood committees played a very important role in Hubei province in attacking the spread, breaking the chain of infection of this virus. So the third aspect is public action versus an atomized society, where basically you don't have the experience of being in unions that do this kind of social knitting together, you know, the work of creating society. Unions that are more than just about bargaining for wages, but are about making society a vibrant part of a human life. And I think that's a huge thing that distinguishes a place like Kerala, for instance, from most of the Western world or the bourgeois order. The fourth aspect is internationalism. As I said, Vietnam sends protective equipment to the United States. We see this all across this domain of the world. You know, Cuban doctors going here and there, everywhere, bringing their skills with them at great personal cost. You know, there were Cuban doctors at Ebola, doctors who had been infected, went back home, were treated and then returned because they were committed to helping people, committed to people, not to profit. On the other side, we see xenophobia in the North Atlantic states in particular, the disgusting xenophobia in the United States, not only from Trump, but from Joe Biden, from so many parts of American society. Anti-Chinese violence has increased in the West as a consequence of this xenophobia. It's disgusting. You know, in Vietnam, what Prime Minister Nguyen said is, when we have people who are infected with COVID-19, we're not going to release any names. We're going to call them case 1, case 2, case 3, because he recognized that there's a problem with pandemics. It creates panic, it creates rumors. You have to quell rumors. You have to settle the nerves of society. You can't inflame it. But of course, you know, in a country like the United States, not just Trump that's doing this. I don't know if you saw Joe Biden's advertisement. It was disgusting. It's not even something that's objectionable. It was outrageous. And I hope people are, have the nerve to call it for what it was, or what it is. So these are the 4 distinguishing features of these 2 lines. Within the bourgeois order, I should say that it's not that this has come as a surprise to anybody. In 2013, 14, 15, 16, the World Health Organization had empaneled, along with the UN, a commission, a high-level commission to look at the deficit of healthcare workers around the world. And Gro Brundtland, who used to be the head of the WHO, when they eventually released the report, they showed that there are at least 18 million fewer healthcare workers than there should be by 2030. They worried that this was a minimum estimate, that there might be very more. You know that in the United States, there's been cuts at public health, The public health workers have been, not hired after not hired at the same rates after the financial crisis. And we know that when hospitals work like real estate companies, they basically hire people in a just-in-time way, just enough people to manage the just enough patients that are coming in. You don't need any surge capacity. You don't need to hire more people. In fact, cut it to the bone. This was prior to COVID-19. There should be no shock because they themselves, Gro Brundtland is a very respected person. She, the UN, the WHO, they themselves were saying there's a serious problem. Nobody cared. They continued to cut. What's the alternative? As I said, there is an alternative in the world. It's not that one needs to, just imagine new things. There are people doing very interesting things. I mentioned Kerala and the cooperative movement. It should be studied. It should be looked at very carefully. I think one of the serious problems that we have in much of the global left is first a kind of casual disparagement of the socialistic experiments around the world. People so casually dismiss Vietnam. In 1975, when the Vietnamese came to take somewhat control over their country, most of the agriculture had been destroyed by napalm, by Agent Orange, and yet, you have Marxists in the Western world criticizing the Vietnamese, saying, oh, they're sold out, they're revisionist, etc. There is absolutely no understanding of history of what places like Vietnam had to essentially inherit from imperialism, from their experience. Similar with Cuba. What Cuba inherited in 1959 was a consequence of what imperialism had done to Cuba. There's no sense of, let's just call it what it is, a sense of history when one analyzes these places. And yet, despite the penalty they've faced from the past, they've experimented, and this particular pandemic has demonstrated that they do have lessons for us. Now, I want to just, in my time remaining, 2 minutes remaining, I want to share with you some projects. Perhaps I can share it in the chat site, websites to go to, and so on. The first is, Tricontinental is a part of a project called the International People's Assembly. We are about 200 organizations around the world, such as the Workers' Party in Tunisia, Communist Party of Nepal, the Landless Workers of Brazil, and so on, spread out over 100 countries. And in March, we created a draft declaration, which we circulated on our website. There are 16 points. I'd invite you to go and look at them. Many of them have to do with the immediate health crisis, but also the hunger crisis, the unemployment crisis, because these things are related to the health crisis. These are not separate issues. We are going to look immediately and see how finance is going to be bailed out. This includes the financialization sector of food, food and food futures, the push to move food from what we can, from land to grow what we can eat to cash crops. These are driven by financialization. So we look in these 16 points. You can go to our website, thetricontinental.org, and I'd welcome you to have a look at the 16 points, engage them as you will. There's another project that we are involved with called the International Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggle. The website is anti-imperialistweek.org. Today on May Day, we released a document called International Call for an Anti-Imperialist May Day in Defense of Life with Dignity. Again, there are several hundred organizations that have signed up. It's still open for more people to sign if you'd like. This is a slightly shorter list. It's got only 10 points. But I think they are heartfelt and they're developed by mass organizations, trade unions, political parties around the world. There's things that I want you to look at. And finally, P. Sainath, Richard Pitthouse, and myself from Tricontinental have written a text called Hunger Gnawing at the Edges of the World. In this text, which is published at newframe.com, which is a South African website, we lay out a set of principles. There are about 10 of them, I think, which have to do with quite basic things, about the food chain workers, trying to understand how first we need to feed people, how surpluses held by agro-businesses need to be expropriated, and so on. So I really welcome you to have a look at these three. Finally, what I would like to say is that look at some of the numbers that are already coming out. The International Labour Organization has said that 2.7 billion workers have already got diminished work. That is, they're either unemployed or they are not able to work enough to survive. That's 81% of the world's workforce. Just breathe that in for a minute. Today's International Workers' Day, it's May Day. 81% of the world's workforce is unable to find sufficient work. The ILO has also said, at a minimum estimate, the world's workers are going to lose $3.4 trillion at a minimum estimate, because they have estimated only to a certain point into the summer. I think this may go much higher. Just a month ago, they had estimated $2 trillion. Now they've increased it to 3.4 trillion. Sainath, Richard, and I have calculated that before COVID-19, 2.5 billion people around the planet were experiencing levels of hunger. 2.5 billion people. The official number is 318 billion. But 318 billion assumes a caloric outtake of almost zero, meaning you're not doing anything. But if you take what they call caloric intake for intense activity, you increase the number of calories a person should average, human body should take, you're going to have hungry people rise to 2.5 billion before COVID-19. Just think about that. That's the scale of the problem we are facing. This is not the time for tepid claims upon civilization. This is not the time for half measures, moderation, coming at society and saying, well, can we limit our demand to masks? We need masks, we need protective equipment, we need hand sanitizer. But let me tell you, we need social transformation. This is an obscene system. It's enough that we've lived so many centuries with it. We should live with this no longer. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. That was fantastic. And thank you to all of our speakers. Well, let's get into some questions. People have been sending some questions. I'm going to begin with some pretty specific questions, and then let's open up to some that I think are for all of you to answer. So the first one is a question for Zenei, and it's a question about Global Nurses United. And the question is about whether or not GNU is working not just across geography, but also across unions. So is GNU also working with people in other sectors inside of hospitals, for instance, like janitorial staff or techs, et cetera? Can you answer that question?
Okay, sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so right now, that has not been considered yet. What they're doing is we started with the nurses, and then we included the healthcare workers in the hospitals. But maybe, when this crisis is over, we can start looking. And it's a challenge meeting, every so often, because different countries have different financial needs. And so, it's something that we might be considering in the near future. But for now, we have not thought about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Zenei. Appreciate that. There's a question here for Kali from somebody who is based in Kingston, Jamaica, and is working on Farming Collective there, and is interested in learning more about, in terms of the farming aspects of what Cooperation Jackson is up to, what you all would identify as kind of the greatest challenges or things to be aware of in setting up a situation like that.
Greatest challenge. I mean, our greatest challenge to date is really been getting a lot of the produce we produce to market. That has been our, I think, single greatest challenge. Some of that has shifted because of how much is just being, now given away for free. But there are distribution networks, that exist, and they've been profoundly changing here in Mississippi as Amazon has entered into the race. What its purchase and control over Whole Foods. And I would say in the last year here locally, we just noticed a shift. You know, first they were going to, I think, you know, they implemented some kind of just-in-time model for their produce, and it failed miserably, you know, the first couple of months. But they've regrouped, and they just basically kind of locked in, you know, a set of kind of contracts and negotiations very similar to the Walmart kind of model, where the producers are basically just subcontractors of Walmart. And we refuse to sign or engage in anything similar, you know, to that nature, even though it appears to be kind of a guaranteed income. Is basically just another form of servitude to their kind of corporate interest, and then you produce for what they need. You know, so you may produce a million watermelons, but nothing that anybody in your neighborhood can eat. So not a direction that we want to go, but that puts a lockdown on where we can sell to. So we've primarily been supplying to a small chain of local community restaurants, you know, Black, Indian, and Thai restaurants in particular in town. So that has been our greatest challenge. But we're an agricultural state still fundamentally. You know, so there's the entry points and the knowledge that exists in the community is still fairly high. The quality of the soil in our area is still fairly rich. The topsoil is still fairly rich. We have a lot of clay that we have to deal with, which is not necessarily good for planting, which Mississippi is, you know, our part of Mississippi is infamous for. So we don't run into those type of structural kind of issues. I think the only one that is somewhat systemic is organic certification. That one is also proving a challenge. There basically is no organic certification. There are a lot of farmers who are using organic practices and more who are heading towards permaculture or Africology, as many in our community refer to it. That is happening. But in terms of other, you know, kind of barriers from the municipal government, anything like that, we don't really have that. It's more of a market problem, market access problem.
Thank you, Kali. Appreciate that. Vijay, here's a question for you, which is about Nicaragua. And the person who's asking the question is saying it's been difficult to kind of get a clear picture from what's happening there. And wonder if you all at Tricontinental have any idea about how that's fitting into this kind of formulation that you laid out. Do you have ideas about that?
Well, no. And one of the things that I'm happy to say is I don't know anything about it. So I'm not going to say anything about it. But I'll take the opportunity to say something else if that's okay. Okay, so I mean, I would like to come back to this example of Kerala because I've looked at the Kerala story. I know it very well. I know Kerala very well. And, you know, it's not well known outside India as it should be for what it has been able to do. What I would want to say is that, you know, it's interesting when you look at these governments. The health minister in Kerala, K.K. Shailaja, you know, is a person who she has people have confidence in her, you know, because she comes out there and talks to the press. And I would, if I had the time and if I had enough skills, I would like to put her press conference side by side with the Trump press conference, just to show people what I mean by hallucination-based versus science-based. You know, this is supposed to be the richest country in the world, the United States, with this hallucinating government. And people are supposed to take this government seriously. It's remarkable. It's so dangerous as well. You know, however he said it, now there are claims that he didn't actually say go out and drink bleach, that he was just sort of freelance, you know, freewheeling or whatever. It doesn't matter what he actually said. The very fact that people thought that he said go and drink bleach is extraordinary. I mean, what kind of political leadership is this? You know, this is the degeneracy of a class. You know, the class that is governing in the United States, in the North American states, they have degenerated. The very fact that the German and the Dutch governments are unwilling to mutualize the debt in the European continent and help out Italy and Spain demonstrates their degeneracy. The fact that the US Treasury Department is unwilling to allow the countries that are the most indebted countries, highly indebted countries in the world, most of them in South America and Africa and Asia and so on, the fact that the US Treasury Department is blocking renegotiation of debt shows their degeneracy. And finally, the fact that the United States government is attempting in the middle of a pandemic to overthrow the government in Venezuela demonstrates their utter degeneracy. You know, I can't think of any other word for it. They hallucinate and they degenerate.
Thank you, Vijay. I have questions that I think anybody could answer. There's a question around scale. So I think, Vijay, you've been talking about, you know, examples from other places in the world where we're talking about like in the millions, in the multi-millions, when you're talking about public action. And I think, Kali, you had talked about the sense that you know, Cooperation Jackson was not yet able to operate at a scale to call realistically for a general strike. The question is really about how to scale up movements, and I think probably particularly this is meant for the United States, but how to scale up movements to the scale at which we can have the kinds of impacts that are necessary for the things that you're laying out. And Zenei, if you'd like to weigh in, you're welcome to do that as well. But maybe we can start with Kali on that one.
Well, I think there's some basic points that start with, you know, having a conversation with the folks that you work with, you know, that you're neighbors with. You know, if you have a spiritual practice that you're in some spiritual practice with, about actually building power and engaging power. And not just casual conversation. I'm not just talking about, you know, what would you like or what do you think? But, you know, us really doing the basis of organizing. I don't think we do enough of that in the United States. I see it being a challenge, you know, something we constantly have to push with our organizers is, yes, it's one thing to meet people where they're at, but we also have to push people a little bit further, you know, than maybe what they're comfortable with, you know, not beyond bounds of respect. But, you know, we have to challenge it and prod and, you know, what people used to call the Socratic method. It still works, you know, dialogue and building with folks, building those relationships still works, still essential. I think one of the things that has always troubled me, you know, the last 20 years, I would say, being honest, is and why I'm harping on this piece is how little I think confidence the left of the United States has in its own beliefs and positions. And that keeps us from, I think, dialoguing with others to not appear to be, you know, coming from outer space or from some other planet. You know, as opposed to, we have arguments, folks, that make concrete sense and always have. You know, and we shouldn't be afraid to articulate those, you know, and to get in the den and fight against, you know, just the madness that's out there. You know, like Trump, you know, Vijay bringing up Trump talking about, you know, will Lysol and injecting light in your body and drinking bleach, like that doesn't come from nowhere. You know, we got a lot of folks now who believe in this country who believe the earth is flat. You know, and I think part of that is because just how bad education is in this country. But it also, I think we haven't engaged in enough conversation and debate and struggle in our own communities around these crazy, you know, backwards ideas that are circulating, all the conspiracy theory. So that's a fundamental piece around how to scale up. And then there's a piece that we still have to figure out is how to start federating, you know, and aligning our work across the ideological divides that actually exist within the left. And start with, like, you know, I don't have to agree with you on everything, particularly not under these conditions. Let's find the things that we can work with. Now, I'm not trying to reduce this down to the points of just community politics. I'm actually articulating for something more. But if we don't start sharing in a shared practice, we're not going to get anywhere in some form or fashion. We can argue about, you know, whether this move or that tactic is the most appropriate one, but really stepping up our game and being in some common dialogue and common practice, I think is where we need to go to even consider scaling up in any significant way.
Yeah, Vijay, do you want to get in on that? Just given some of the international examples you've been offering. One other layer that just got raised in the chat that I think might be interesting is also, are the material conditions under COVID different for thinking about scaling up?
So, I mean, the first thing to say is that when we look at the situation of Vietnam or Kerala or Cuba or any of these other places, they have a 100-year project. You know, Kerala is about an 80-year project. It doesn't come out of nowhere. This is the 100th anniversary of the Indian Communist movement. It has had a relatively unbroken history, unlike in the United States, which had to face McCarthyism, you know, the illegal period, this act, that act, I mean, the disparagement, the whole bourgeois media against the left. I mean, the American left faced much more than the left in other places. Let's face it, I think that's there. It has a broken history, whereas in these places, and then secondly, I think in places like the United States, there is a trap that the left gets into. Every 4 years, every 2 years, the trap is electoral. You know, rally around Biden, you're fighting against each other and so on. The left in the United States, it seems to me, and you know, far be it for me to make any big judgment, but it seems to me, is never given the chance to develop a long-term project. And you know, there's got to be a 10-year plan. It would be superb if, as Kali said, you know, in that mode of federation, if different organizations, groups could come together, could say, let's develop a 10-year plan. What is our agenda? You know, I suggested this at a Democratic Socialist of America call just about a week ago. And people said, there's not enough time, you know, climate change, we need to do something now. Well, I get that, you know, I understand that. I understand the impatience, but you have to balance the necessity, the urgency of acting now, the necessity to act now with developing a long-term project, you know, to draw different people in, to build cooperatives. You cannot build a left movement anywhere in the world if you're not immediately addressing the needs of people. And the way to address them is exactly how Cooperation Jackson is doing. You have to build cooperatives. You have to engage at the level of production. You can't just create, you know, cooperatives in the level of circulation, you know, cooperative coffee shops and so on. You've got to get into the level of production. If you read, and I'm an orthodox Marxist, if you read Marx writes of cooperatives as possible communism. You know, you cannot just do it at the circulation level. And what I see happening a lot is circulation-based cooperatives. You need to do it in production. This means it's a long-term 10, 15-year project, you know. You're growing things. It takes time. You have to be patient. On the one side, don't get stuck in this debate about elections. Dig your field, plant your seeds and grow and take time. I think that's very important.
Thank you for that. Zenei, do you want to get in on this question?
Yeah, sure. What's happening, like what Kali and Vijay had said, the reason why GNU came together as a federated model, because we agreed on what outstanding agenda we have, but then we cannot dictate how they would fight back, because different countries has different governments, and the way some nurses are treated in different countries, you would be surprised. Like I would say in the Philippines, there's a Filipino Nurses United that was formed, and so they are viewed as the terrorist nurses by the Philippine government. So we have to be careful how we engage them with our fights and with what actions we would take, but we operate under the same principle, which is patient care and staffing ratios, and you know, that's the common thread that unite us. Here in the US, believe it or not, we still have nurses who have different views of joining unions. They view it as a labor organization, and that as nurses, they are professionals and they should not be joining a labor organization. So we have to do a lot of education in light of that. And also we need to tell them that we can use a labor organization in conjunction with a professional organization. And that's what we are. National Nurses United is both a labor organization and professional organization. But it took a lot of, I would say, energy on our organizers and our nurses leaders, because again, like I said, a lot of the nurses do not see the nurses union as a professional union. So we have that challenge too.
Thank you for that. As we see, workers fighting back, organizing themselves, trying to carve out some space amid the pandemic, we're also, as frequently happens, seeing increased activity and more aggressive activity on the part of law enforcement and the state to suppress that kind of struggle. And I'm wondering if you all have thoughts about how worker movements can be making moves even as those repressive forces accelerate and expand. Anybody interested in starting that one?
I mean, I'll just say that this week the Delhi police has arrested some of our comrades. Late last week, the government of India went after one of our leftward authors, and he is now in jail, Anand Teltumde. They went after my colleague Gautam Navlakha. He's now in jail. This is the middle of the pandemic. They're arresting dissenters and putting them in prison. I mean, we expect that. This is not a surprise. We expect them to come after us. We want to overthrow them. We declare our aim to overthrow their form of government. They will fight back like this. Now it's up to us to convince people that we are right and they are wrong. I don't have a personal feeling, why are they arresting us? Yes, they will arrest us. We want to, destroy capitalism. It's a frontline struggle. And I think we have to look at it like that. Now, the issue is, I understand that it, in some places, becomes very dangerous. In Colombia, for instance, almost daily somebody seems to be killed. A frontline fighter is getting killed. Mostly they are Afro-Colombians. Mostly they are indigenous Colombians. They are being targeted. The moment in a country like Colombia, you have a peace negotiation, the state goes after frontline fighters. We lost Berta Cáceres in Honduras. I mean, this is what they do. When I use the word degenerate many times. I've just finished a book which will come out. It's called Washington Bullets. The preface of the book is written by Evo Morales. Look at what they did to Evo Morales. Evo Morales took a country that has been thoroughly sapped of its energy and resources, helped build it up. People may have criticisms of him, but did the government of Evo Morales deserve the coup d'etat? Did Bolivia deserve what happened to it? Think about that. I know lots of people in the United States says, well, Morales did this mistake, he did that mistake. Does that mean that you support the coup d'etat? There is a kind of politics of aesthetics. I don't like Maduro, okay, he can be removed. I find that such a superficial attitude to the world. Oh, I like Chavez, but I don't like Maduro. It's not shopping, friends. You're not in the line in Whole Foods, at an aisle wondering which yogurt to buy. That's not how politics works. It's not about who you like. Politics is about a class struggle on an international level. Wake up, see it for what it is.
Kali or Zenei, either of you want to?
I echo what Vijay just laid out. We know from our own history here, they don't make any bones about targeting, infiltrating, undermining, and we just have to expect that. As my parents used to tell me the enemy's going to do what they're going to do, period. You know, and the question of what are we going to do? That really is the real question. What are we prepared to, you know, organize and quite frankly, you know, seize that to eliminate some of the old school, you know, nice, or the new school nice language and put it in plain terms. That's really what it comes down to.
Great, thank you. Zenei, do you want to comment on that?
I think as nurses, I think we are in a different kind of situation because we don't get assaulted, or we don't get targeted, as Vijay was saying, because they view us as the healers, they view us as the people that would be helping patients. So I think we are luckier in that regard. That's why we are not being targeted, except of course in some of the countries that are members of GNU where they are viewed differently. But here in the US, I think they view us as the healers, and so they should not be touching us. And I think we're getting off pretty easy in that regard.
Thank you all. As we wrap up tonight's conversation, I'm just wondering if I can pose one more question to you. We're definitely not going to get to everything tonight, I'm sorry. And I'll try to share some of these questions with the individual speakers after we sign off. But I'm wondering if, you know, I've heard each of you in different ways talk about, like, there's kind of no going back to a normal, right? Things are not going to go back to the way that they have been, and probably shouldn't go back to the way that they have been, right? So I'm wondering if each of you could just leave us this evening with one kind of thought for the future, one charge, one lesson to take up in people's kind of local communities here, wherever they're listening tonight, that, you know, is a lesson from somewhere else, or is a lesson that you've learned through doing your work. And it can be anything. So Zenei, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. What I would say is that this pandemic has exposed the deficiencies in our healthcare system, and so I would urge people that are listening in, and I know I might be preaching to the choir, but it's about time that we push for a single payer kind of system for healthcare, like a Medicare for all system, because we saw the disparity in how patients who do not have insurance or healthcare are being treated versus those who have the ability to be able to seek medical help right away. So it's about time that I urge everyone to please join the nurses, National Nurses United, in our fight to achieve Medicare for all, for, you know, healthcare for all, because healthcare, like I said, is a human right. So please join us in that fight.
Thank you. Vijay, how about you?
Yeah, for some reason today I'm using a lot of examples of shopping, but I think in an advanced capitalist society or a decayed capitalist society, it's worthwhile to use those examples. You know, it's a funny world you live in where it's perfectly acceptable for somebody to want, for instance, a mobile phone, a cell phone that never breaks. That's the very best cell phone. You know, nobody's willing to compromise on the commodities they buy. They don't have a moderate attitude towards the commodities they buy. I'll get the second best couch. Okay, I'll settle for an average couch. No, you want a really good couch, if you can afford it, up to the level of afford. I want the best phone, I want the best this. But when it comes to politics, people are being told you should just accept what you're given. You know, have a moderate attitude. I mean, what is this? You know, what is this attitude? I find it remarkable. And, you know, I'm 53 years old. And I look at the world and I say, it's unbelievable that in my lifetime, people have been able to make, you know, a tiny little telephone become a computer, and still half the world cannot eat. You can produce incredible technology, people can't eat. Hunger cannot be abolished. I mean, this is insane. And yet, the people on the liberal side, on the left side, have such a uninflamed attitude toward the world. They are so willing to be moderated. And I just don't understand that, Rachel. I just don't get it. Like, how do you get so upset when your phone doesn't work? And how do you not get upset when you know that there are people around you starving?
Thank you. Kali, you want to bring us home?
Still cracking up at that. It's a damn good analogy and well-crafted point. Only thing I would say is not local. What I'm taking away and what I'm arguing for out of this pandemic is really trying to flip part of it on its head. How many times have we heard, about any major kind of global discussion? The economy's too big, or it's too complex, and it's too much, it's too intricate to halt or alter or shift in any fundamental way, right? And that it just works by its own magical, majestical logic. And particularly when it comes to dealing with the climate and species crisis that we're facing. We've been told over and over again, we can't make these big changes. In a span of 3 weeks, we saw when the political will exists, the world can shift and shift very quickly. So I want us all to sit with that on the serious side and open our imaginations based on this experience to what the real possibilities are. We can't accept excuses from the ruling class anymore that things are too complex or too large or too dynamic, that they can't shift. I think this is supposed to be a family-friendly program, but that's bullshit. Let's walk away with the real knowledge that if the political will exists, we can see profound changes. If nothing, COVID-19 has demonstrated that where the political will exists, profound things can happen and happen very quickly. The question really becomes, I'll end with this, who's going to determine what the priorities are? Who's going to determine what the outcome in the direction is? It cannot be them. It has to be us.
Thank you all so much for telling us the truth, for calling it like it is, and for infusing some inspiration and some forward thinking, some bold thinking into our evenings. Appreciate you all so much. Again, we heard from Vinny Cortez of National Nurses United, Kali Akuno from Cooperation Jackson, and from Vijay Prashad from Continental Institute for Social Research. I want to remind you that we are here every week for 6 weeks. We'll be here through May. And the organizations that bring you these each week could use your love and support and props. So that's the Red Nation, that is Center for Political Education, and that's the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. And you can see our Twitter handles there, so give us a shout out in the world. And following weeks, if you can go back, Nick, thank you. Next week, we'll be talking about sanctions on Iran. The following week, Palestine and the blockade on Gaza. The following week, China and US relations. So if that was piqued tonight by what you heard Vijay talking about, come back on May 22nd. And the last week, May 29th, we'll be talking about prison industrial complex abolition and the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you again for participating tonight. Thank you again to our amazing speakers, and we will see everybody next week.